Michael Joseph Jackson was born in the summer of 1958 in Gary, Indiana, and rose from a working-class childhood into the dazzling orbit of global superstardom. From the Jackson 5 to his reign as the king of pop, he inspired adoration that spanned continents. Yet even as his music rewrote the soundtrack of the late 20th century, his personal life became a storm of scandal and suspicion. Jackson's relationships were complex and often unsettling. He cultivated an image of eternal childhood, surrounding himself with young companions at his Neverland estate. The accusations that followed were devastating, charges of abuse that fractured his reputation and turned many admirers into harsh detractors. Courts acquitted him, but in the court of public opinion, the man once cherished for his moonwalk became a symbol of mistrust and moral collapse. The final years were marked by frailty. Preparing for a comeback tour, Jackson's life ended suddenly in Los Angeles in June of 2009, the result of a substance-related incident under the watch of his personal physician. The irony was inescapable. A man who had seemed untouchable on stage, undone in silence by the very quest to reclaim his throne. His burial was guarded and exclusive, a contrast to his public life. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, Jackson was entombed in the Great Mausoleum, a fortress of marble and stained glass that also houses Hollywood legends. Yet despite the grandeur, the resting place carries a cold distance, closed to the public and shrouded in secrecy. For a man who once drew millions to stadiums, his grave is hidden away, accessible only to select family and friends. The tragedy of Michael Jackson's end lies in that contrast. A life once adored by crowds, sealed away in solitude. A mausoleum meant to preserve his memory, yet it symbolizes how controversy buried him long before death did. Charles Mills Manson was born in November of 1934, and from the start, his life carried the marks of abandonment and violence. Though remembered now as one of history's most reviled cult leaders, his earliest ambition was not to command a murderous following, but to carve out a place in music. He played guitar with a ragged determination, drifting through San Francisco's counterculture, even brushing against members of the Beach Boys and others who briefly entertained his songs. But the industry rejected him, and that rejection festered into rage. Manson gathered around him a circle of followers who worshipped his every word. He spoke of apocalyptic visions, of race wars and divine authority, and he wielded his failed music as a weapon of prophecy. What might have been remembered as a struggling songwriter instead became a man orchestrating atrocities that shocked the world. In the summer of 1969, his family committed brutal murders in Los Angeles, crimes that carved his name into the darkest ledger of American history. Prison became his stage for the rest of his life. His notoriety only grew as he delivered bizarre interviews, his eyes wild with self-importance and delusion. By the time he died in November of 2017 at the age of 83, Manson had spent nearly half a century behind bars. Death did not redeem him, nor did it bring dignity. His body became the subject of a grotesque struggle, with several individuals claiming the right to his remains. Ultimately, he was cremated in a small, private ceremony, his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location. Unlike the polished marble tombs of the stars he once envied, Manson left no gravestone, no marker, no shrine. Only the echo of infamy. The irony is cruel and complete. A man who dreamed of filling stadiums with song left the world in silence, his body reduced to ash, his name remembered not for melody, but for murder. Harvey Philip Specter was born in the Bronx in December of 1939, and from the beginning his restless genius was evident. By his early 20s, he had reshaped the sound of popular music, building the fabled wall of sound that turned ordinary singles into orchestral monuments. He produced the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, the Crystals, and even worked with the Beatles, cementing himself as one of the most influential figures in 20th century music. Yet beneath the brilliance lay cruelty, paranoia, and violence that would ultimately consume him. Spector's relationships, whether personal or professional, were marked by domination. He demanded obedience in the studio, isolating singers until they bent to his will. In private, his reputation darkened further, with stories of threats, guns, and psychological abuse. Musicians who once revered him came to fear him, speaking of a man who treated genius as license for tyranny. In February of 2003, the world saw that darkness made flesh. Actress Lana Clarkson was found dead in his California mansion after what authorities ruled as a gunshot fired by Spector himself. The trial that followed stripped away the last illusions of eccentricity, revealing instead a pattern of intimidation and violence. Convicted of second-degree murder, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison, his career and legacy shattered. Spector died behind bars in January of 2021 at the age of 81 from complications of illness. His body was cremated, his ashes given to family, and his end passed quietly compared to the roaring symphonies he once commanded. There was no grand mausoleum, no shrine to his sound, only silence. The irony is stark. The man who layered music into cathedrals of sound now lies in obscurity, his remains reduced to ash. For all his mastery of echo and reverb, Phil Spector's final note was one of emptiness. His grave, as unremarkable as the crimes that eclipsed his genius, were unforgettable. IZR Luster Turner Jr. was born in November of 1931 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and his musical instincts emerged before he was even a teenager. He is often credited as one of the architects of rock and roll, his recording of Rocket 88 in the early 1950s hailed by many historians as a blueprint for the genre. Yet while his place in music history should have been secured, his legacy became inseparable from violence, cruelty, and abuse. Turner's professional life soared when he discovered and nurtured the voice of Anna Mae Bullock, who the world came to know as Tina Turner. Together, they created electrifying performances that defined rhythm and blues in the 1960s and 70s. But behind the stage lights was a nightmare. Tina Turner endured years of violence and humiliation at Ike's hands, a story she revealed with unflinching honesty in her memoir, and later in a Hollywood film. By the time the world fully understood the depths of his brutality, admiration had turned to revulsion. His career faltered, and the years that followed were consumed by arrests, drug battles, and the hollow attempts of comebacks. While he did earn a Grammy in his later years, recognition could not redeem him in the eyes of the public. In December of 2007, Ike Turner died in San Marcos, California, at the age of 76, from a cocaine-related incident compounded by heart disease. He was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, a cemetery filled with Hollywood legends. Yet his grave, though respectable in setting, carries none of the reverence granted to others buried there. Visitors pass it without pause, the name etched in stone, reminding more of scandal than of music. The tragedy of Ike Turner's end lies in the imbalance. A man who helped ignite a musical revolution is remembered not for his songs, but for his cruelty. His burial, neat and quiet, stands in sharp contrast to the violence that defined his life, a silence that condemns rather than redeems. Jerry Lee Lewis was born in September of 1935 in Faraday, Louisiana, into a family that believed music was both gift and salvation. From the moment he touched a piano, his ferocity was unmistakable. By the late 1950s, he had stormed onto the scene with Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On and Great Balls of Fire, performances so wild they seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. For a moment, Lewis stood as the living embodiment of rock and roll's reckless energy. But his rise collapsed almost as quickly as it began. In 1958, during a tour of England, it was revealed that Lewis had secretly married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown. The scandal ignited outrage on both sides of the Atlantic. Concerts were canceled, radio stations banned his music, and fans who once screamed his name now turned their backs in disgust. Though he would continue to record and perform for decades, the stain of that revelation never left him. Lewis's personal life remained turbulent. Multiple marriages, drug and alcohol abuse, lawsuits, and violent outbursts hardened his image as a man impossible to separate from scandal. Even as he was honored late in life with inductions into halls of fame, many regarded him not as a pioneer but as a pariah whose talent was forever corrupted by his choices. He died in October of 2022 at the age of 87 in DeSoto County, Mississippi. His funeral was held in Faraday, near the place of his birth, where admirers and detractors alike gathered in uneasy recognition of his legacy. He was buried at the Heron Family Cemetery in Louisiana, a modest resting place far from the grandeur of the stages he once set ablaze. The irony is sharp. Jerry Lee Lewis played with a fire that seemed destined to make him immortal, yet he lies in a humble grave, his name remembered less for the notes he struck than for the scandal that extinguished his brilliance. James Ambrose Johnson, Jr., better known as Rick James, was born in February of 1948 in Buffalo, New York. From his earliest days, his charisma was undeniable. By the late 1970s and early 80s, his funk anthems, most famously Super Freak, filled clubs with irresistible energy. James embodied excess, strutting across stages in leather and lace, his image larger than life. Yet the same appetite for freedom and sensation that powered his music soon devoured his legacy. James cultivated a reputation for indulgence that turned increasingly sinister. His relationships were marked by volatility and his behavior by violence. He was arrested more than once for assaults, including a notorious case of kidnapping and abuse that shattered whatever goodwill remained among fans. Even within the music industry, where decadence was often excused, Rick James was seen as a man out of control, a caricature of self-destruction. The later years brought brief flickers of revival. He enjoyed a surge of renewed fame when MC Hammer sampled Super Freak for You Can't Touch This. But the shadow of his criminal record and addiction made him a cautionary tale, rather than a triumphant survivor. By the time of his death in August of 2004, from heart failure compounded by a lifetime of drug use, the name Rick James was as infamous as it was celebrated. His burial took place at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, the city that had first shaped him. The grave is plain, unadorned compared to the flamboyant costumes and lavish mansions of his prime. Fans occasionally leave offerings, but many approach his resting place with conflicted feelings, torn between admiration for his music and revulsion at his crimes. The irony is haunting. Rick James once declared himself the Super Freak, basking in notoriety as though it were glory. Yet his final resting place strips away the spectacle, leaving only stone and silence, a reminder that excess, when pushed too far, becomes its own prison. Kevin Michael Allen, better known as G.G. Allin, was born in August of 1956 in Lancaster, New Hampshire. From his earliest days, his life was marked by dysfunction, violence, and instability, and those same qualities would later define his career. In the underground world of punk rock, Allin became infamous not for his musical talent, but for his grotesque and destructive stage persona. Allin's performances were less concerts than spectacles of degradation. He hurled himself at audiences, engaged in violence, and indulged in depravity that left even hardened punk fans appalled. He promised, repeatedly, that he would one day die by self-inflicted harm on stage, turning his concerts into macabre wagers between life and death. That pledge, and the fear that it might be fulfilled, gave him a notoriety that outstripped his actual recordings. His personal life offered no relief from the chaos. Arrests, substance abuse, and estrangement from friends and family left him drifting between jail cells and dingy clubs. In June of 1993, after a show in New York, he overdosed on heroin at the age of 36. True to his reputation, his death was as sordid and chaotic as his life. The burial became a grotesque continuation of his legend. At St. Rose Cemetery in Littleton, New Hampshire, mourners treated the funeral less as a farewell than as a final performance. His body, placed in an open casket wearing a leather jacket and jockstrap, was surrounded by fans who poured liquor and drugs into the coffin. Some even defiled the moment further, treating the burial as a punk spectacle rather than a solemn ritual. The irony is chilling. G.G. Allin longed to turn death itself into theater, and in a sense, he succeeded, though not on the stage he imagined. His grave stands as a grim reminder of the spectacle of self-destruction, a final resting place tainted by the same chaos that consumed his life. José Duane Ricardo Onfroy, known to the world as XXX Tentacion, was born in January of 1998 in Plantation, Florida. From his earliest recordings, he carried a raw, emotional intensity that drew millions of young listeners. His music shifted between anguish and aggression, reflecting the turbulence of his short life. For some, he was a generational voice. For others, he was a figure defined by violence and scandal. His relationships were stained by accusations of abuse and cruelty. Court documents painted a picture of rage and control, allegations that divided the public. Admirers defended his artistry, insisting he was misunderstood, while detractors saw only a dangerous young man elevated by notoriety. That polarization made him one of the most loved and hated figures of his era. Onfroy's life ended suddenly in June of 2018. At just 20 years old, he was gunned down during a robbery outside a motorcycle dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida. The murder shocked his fans and instantly transformed him into a martyr in the eyes of many, even as critics reminded the world of the shadows that trailed him. His burial reflected the contradictions of his fame. He was laid to rest in a grand mausoleum at Gardens of Boca Raton Memorial Park, a marble structure adorned with flowers and tributes, guarded and exclusive. Fans gathered outside its gates, leaving notes and tears, though many could never step inside to see his final resting place. The irony is sharp. A young man who sang of despair and chaos now lies in a tomb designed for permanence and reverence. Yet even here, the division endures, for XXXTentacion is remembered as both victim and villain, a legacy as troubled as the life it seeks to immortalize. Donald Clyde Spade Cooley was born in December of 1910 in Oklahoma, and for a time he stood at the glittering center of Western swing. Known as the King of Western Swing, his television show in the 1940s and 50s drew huge audiences, his music blending country charm with big band polish. He performed in cowboy films, appeared on radio, and built an empire of popularity that seemed destined to last. Yet behind the polished smile and tailored suits lay cruelty that would destroy him. Cooley's relationships were riddled with jealousy and violence. His marriage to Ella Mae Evans, a striking singer and dancer, ended in horror. In 1961, in a fit of rage and suspicion, he brutally murdered her in front of their daughter. The crime shocked not only his fans, but the entire nation, stripping away the veneer of wholesome stardom and revealing a man of monstrous brutality. Convicted of first-degree murder, Cooley was sentenced to life in prison. For years, he lived not in the glow of stage lights, but under the weight of iron bars. In November of 1969, just as he was briefly granted parole to perform a benefit concert, he collapsed backstage from a heart attack and died. The moment carried a strange irony, for his return to music ended in death before the audience could hear a note. He was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, a Catholic graveyard where Hollywood stars and families lie in orderly rows. Yet Cooley's grave is modest, nearly anonymous, far removed from the grandiose titles he once claimed. Few visit, and fewer still speak of him as a musician. The irony is harsh. Spade Cooley sought to be remembered as a king of music, but his grave whispers only of violence and disgrace. What once glittered in lights now lies forgotten in stone, a testament to how swiftly fame can be obliterated by cruelty. John Edmund Andrew Phillips was born in August of 1935 in Parris Island, South Carolina, and rose to fame as the creative force behind the Mamas and the Papas. With songs like California Dreamin' and Monday Monday, he gave voice to the optimism and disillusionment of the 1960s. To the world, he appeared as the architect of harmony, a man who wove sunshine and melancholy into unforgettable melodies. Yet beneath the music, Phillips carried a darkness that eventually shattered his legacy. His relationships were troubled from the start. He married multiple times, his unions often collapsing under the weight of infidelity and substance abuse. But the most damning shadow emerged decades later, when his daughter Mackenzie accused him of incest, a claim that horrified the public and stained his name beyond repair. Even among peers, Phillips was notorious for betrayal, manipulation, and an arrogance that made enemies faster than friends. By the 1970s, his life had unraveled into chaos. Heroin and cocaine dictated his days, leaving his talent squandered and his reputation scarred. Though he attempted comebacks and collaborations, none could erase the stories of abuse and excess. His name, once a byword for the golden glow of folk rock, became a reminder of how the ideals of the counterculture curdled into ruin. Phillips died in March of 2001 at the age of 65, the result of heart failure following a liver transplant. His body was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, a cemetery of stars and legends. Yet his grave is not a celebrated shrine. Visitors linger at the monuments of other figures nearby, while Phillips lies in comparative silence. The irony is cruel. John Phillips crafted songs that promised escape and harmony, yet his own life collapsed into betrayal and scandal. His grave, quiet and overshadowed, reflects not the beauty of his music, but the darkness of the man who wrote it. Russell Tyrone Jones, known by his chaotic stage name Old Dirty Bastard, was born in November of 1968 in Brooklyn, New York. A founding member of the Wu-Tang Clan, he embodied the wild, unfiltered spirit of hip-hop in the 1990s. His verses were unpredictable, his delivery erratic, and his persona larger than life. Fans adored him for his refusal to conform, but that same volatility made him one of the most divisive figures in rap. Jones's personal life unraveled in a haze of arrests, drug battles, and public meltdowns. He was arrested repeatedly for everything from drug possession to assault, his mugshots becoming nearly as well known as his album covers. At award shows, he seized the microphone to declare his grievances, turning ceremonies into spectacles. To some, he was a rebel fighting against the industry. To others, he was a man squandering talent through chaos. By the early 2000s, his health and career were both in decline. Years of substance abuse left him fragile, even as he attempted a return to music. In November of 2004, just 2 days before his 36th birthday, Jones collapsed in a Manhattan recording studio. The cause was a drug-related incident, his heart unable to withstand the strain of years of abuse. His funeral was held in Brooklyn, where crowds gathered in grief and disbelief. He was buried at Brooklyn's Mount Zion Cemetery, his grave visited by loyal fans who scrawled tributes, left bottles, and blasted Wu-Tang tracks in his honor. Yet the site is as conflicted as his legacy, part shrine and part cautionary tale. The irony is sharp. Old Dirty Bastard lived as though the rules could never contain him, reveling in disorder as though it were art. In death, he lies beneath a quiet stone, a name carved in permanence that belies the chaos of the man himself. Miles Dewey Davis III was born in May of 1926 in Alton, Illinois, and by the time he was a teenager, his trumpet had already begun to change the language of jazz. From bebop to cool jazz, from electric fusion to experimental forms, Davis reinvented the art of sound with a daring that made him one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Yet if his music commanded reverence, his character commanded resentment. Davis's relationships were defined by arrogance, volatility, and cruelty. He was known to belittle fellow musicians, to dismiss critics with contempt, and to treat women with violence and disdain. Several of his partners accused him of abuse, and even friends in the industry spoke openly of his hostility. For every admirer who hailed him as a genius, there were others who despised him as a tyrant in both studio and home. Drugs haunted his career, weaving cycles of collapse and revival. Periods of brilliance were followed by years of addiction and withdrawal, his reputation further hardened by tales of excess and cruelty. Still, when he lifted the trumpet, his genius was undeniable, leaving listeners torn between admiration for the art and disdain for the man. In September of 1991, Miles Davis died in Santa Monica, California at the age of 65, from complications of pneumonia, stroke, and respiratory failure. His passing silenced a horn that had reshaped music across 4 decades, but it also reopened debates about the life behind the legend. Davis was entombed at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, in the historic section reserved for cultural giants. His grave lies among musicians, artists, and writers, a place of honor in stone. Yet for some, the site carries a sharp irony. The man who alienated so many in life now rests in a community of the very peers he once dismissed. The legacy of Miles Davis is thus fractured. His trumpet will forever echo his genius, but his grave stands as reminder that brilliance does not erase cruelty, and admiration often lives uneasily alongside disdain. Eric Lynn Wright, known as Eazy-E, was born in September of 1964 in Compton, California. He rose from the streets into hip-hop history as a founding member of NWA, a group that redefined rap with brutal honesty about crime, poverty, and police brutality. To many, he was a pioneer who gave voice to the unheard. To others, he glorified violence and misogyny, turning raw reality into profitable spectacle. Wright's relationships were marked by conflict and betrayal. Within NWA, friendships soured into feuds, lawsuits, and bitter rivalries, most famously with Ice Cube and Dr. Dre. Outside the studio, his reputation for womanizing and exploitation earned him contempt, even as his entrepreneurial spirit was admired. The tension between admiration and disgust became his defining contradiction. In early 1995, his life took a shocking turn. Admitted to the hospital with what seemed like asthma, doctors revealed he was dying of AIDS. He announced the diagnosis publicly, urging others to learn from his mistakes, but within weeks, he was gone. In March of 1995, at just 30 years old, Wright died, leaving behind 12 children and a storm of unfinished battles. His funeral in Los Angeles drew thousands, with fans, celebrities, and critics alike gathering to mourn and debate his legacy. He was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California, beneath a polished headstone etched with his name and titles. The grave is often visited, adorned with flowers, tributes, and the symbols of a culture he helped shape. The irony is poignant. Eazy-E built his image as the ruthless godfather of gangsta rap. Yet his final days were filled not with bravado, but with frailty and regret. His resting place reflects both fame and infamy, a reminder that cultural revolutionaries can be both heroes and villains, celebrated and despised in equal measure. John Simon Ritchie, who renamed himself Sid Vicious, was born in May of 1957 in London. He embodied the chaos and self-destruction of the punk movement, more symbol than musician, more spectacle than artist. As bassist for the Sex Pistols, his snarling presence, spiked hair, and sneer became the very image of rebellion. Yet behind the facade, Sid was a young man swallowed by addiction and violence. His relationship with Nancy Spungen defined his short and catastrophic life. Together, they spiraled through drug-fueled nights, their bond more toxic than romantic. Friends and bandmates watched helplessly as the pair dragged one another deeper into despair. In October of 1978, Nancy was found dead in their New York hotel room, stabbed in the stomach. Though Sid was charged with her murder, the case never came to trial, and her death remains one of punk's most infamous tragedies. Sid himself did not live to face justice or redemption. Released on bail, he overdosed on heroin in February of 1979, just 21 years old. Some say the overdose was deliberate, a final act of self-destruction after Nancy's death. Others believe it was simply the inevitable conclusion of a young man lost to chaos. His mother scattered his ashes at Nancy Spungen's grave in Pennsylvania, a final gesture of devotion that horrified her family and cemented their doomed love story. There is no formal headstone for Sid Vicious, no shrine where fans can mourn him alone. His legacy is tied forever to Nancy, their names tangled in infamy. The irony is haunting. Sid Vicious sought to embody punk's rejection of order and tradition, and in death, he succeeded. Without a grave of his own, his memory lingers as restless as his life, a ghost of noise and ruin scattered to the wind. Salvatore Philip, Sonny Bono, was born in February of 1935 in Detroit, Michigan, and first found fame as half of the duo Sonny and Cher. With his bowl haircut, flashy suits, and buoyant stage presence, he became a symbol of lighthearted pop in the 1960s. Yet behind the charm, Bono was often dismissed as opportunistic, riding Cher's talent more than shaping it. And later, his shift into politics made him a lightning rod for criticism. His personal life was dominated by his stormy marriage and eventual divorce from Cher. What began as a partnership of harmony and humor collapsed under the strain of infidelity and control. Cher emerged as a superstar in her own right, while Sonny increasingly appeared as the man who had once stood in her shadow. The bitterness of their split left fans divided, and Bono's image suffered as he reinvented himself. In the 1980s and 90s, he entered politics, aligning with the Republican Party and rising to serve as a congressman from California. Admirers praised his determination, but critics accused him of hypocrisy, seeing his shift from entertainer to conservative politician as self-serving. The same man who once sang of love and laughter was now accused of opportunism and betrayal. In January of 1998, tragedy struck. While skiing in Lake Tahoe, Bono collided with a tree and died instantly at the age of 62. His death shocked the nation, bringing a sudden and dramatic end to a career already marked by reinvention and contradiction. He was buried at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California. His grave is simple, with a stone etched with the words, "And the beat goes on," a phrase that echoes both his music and the irony of his passing. Visitors leave flowers, but the site remains as polarizing as the man himself. The irony is sharp. Sonny Bono once thrived in the glow of stage lights and political cameras, but his grave is humble, his legacy debated. For some, he is a beloved entertainer. For others, a man who turned charm into calculated ambition, now remembered in stone with a phrase that outlived him. David Van Cortlandt Crosby was born in August of 1941 in Los Angeles, California, and for a time he seemed destined to embody the golden dream of American music. As a founding member of the Byrds, and later Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, he helped to create harmonies that defined the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. His voice could lift a simple melody into something transcendent, and his songs captured the hopes and the disillusionments of a generation. Yet for all his artistry, Crosby's life was marred by arrogance, betrayal, and self-destruction. His relationships with bandmates were notoriously tumultuous. He quarreled with Roger McGuinn, feuded bitterly with Stephen Stills, clashed with Neil Young, and alienated Graham Nash, who once counted him as a brother. His arrogance, sharp tongue, and drug-fueled erratic behavior burned bridges until only a handful of allies remained. Even in his later years, his tendency to belittle others publicly left scars that time could not erase. Crosby's personal life was equally turbulent. He battled addictions that led to arrests, imprisonment, and health crises. His liver failed, requiring a transplant in the 1990s, yet he continued to push his body into decline. Despite brief comebacks and flashes of reconciliation, he remained a figure as divisive as he was admired, a man celebrated for his art but condemned for his cruelty. In January of 2023, David Crosby died at the age of 81. His death closed the book on a career that had spanned 6 decades but left as many broken friendships as celebrated songs. He was laid to rest quietly in California without the fanfare that might have marked the passing of a legend. Details of his burial remain understated, a private farewell rather than a public spectacle. For a man who had once filled stadiums, his end was hushed, a whisper rather than a chorus. The irony is striking. David Crosby gave the world harmonies of breathtaking beauty, yet his own life was discordant, marked by bitterness and estrangement. His grave reflects that contradiction, a quiet resting place for a man remembered as much for betrayal as for song.